Okay, John, I believe you are up first.
All right. Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about compatibility. And by that, I'm talking mostly about between when we ship 1.18 with alpha, between I don't know, 1.19, 1.20, whatever we decide is beta, and what kind of compatibility guarantees we're going to offer. I recommend none. And to further that, I recommend that we start off intentionally making a breaking change so that we're not overly cautious about compatibility and making Ambient worse off, by favoring backwards compatibility or doing the right thing. That's my proposal. Part of this is for someone to scream, no, we shouldn't do that, so we can have this conversation now instead of 6 months down the line when we when it comes down to it. So that's my pitch. Let me know what you guys think.
So the idea is that we've already had a lot of breaking changes in Ambient to begin with, right? It doesn't respect all the same APIs as Istio does in sidecar mode. Then there would be a second set of breaking changes when we go to beta?
I think what your first thing was about sidecar to Ambient, which is true. I'm talking more about Ambient alpha to Ambient beta. Like, no one should expect to upgrade an Ambient cluster without downtime. No one should expect for the old version and the new version to interoperate or anything along those lines.
So then the message to users needs to be that it's a true alpha effective.
Yes,
unlike
which we
alphas.
Yeah, and we actually, on the docs, it says that. It's like, it literally says this is a real alpha, not like our other alpha features. So,
So that's how it should be. I mean, what is? I'm not sure if we should intentionally make a breaking change, but I guarantee you that we'll make a breaking change unintentionally. So the docs need to be absolutely clear that it's an alpha in 1.18. We can revisit in 1.19. No, that's
yes. So I agree. That's how it should be as alpha. Historically, that's not how we've treated alphas, and I want to make sure that 6 months down the line, when we want to make a breaking change that is incompatible with the alpha, but is far better in what we want to do, that someone in this group is not going to say, hey, but I want to upgrade from alpha to beta with no downtime. I want to find that out now instead of 6 months from now is really the goal. So if no one says that, then...
I'm going to say something. So, John, we had a discussion in a previous meeting about safe Istio, and that APIs that are already beta and that we commit to them to be beta, even in Ambient, need to remain beta. So if Gamma is beta and someone is using Gamma, it is expected they will not have to make changes when we upgrade to whatever version of, Ambient or whatever else. And you understand what I mean? I mean, if a user is using Gamma, we don't guarantee, seamless migration. We don't guarantee anything. But if you use Gamma API, you should not have to make changes. Or if you use any beta API.
So you're saying if you use a beta plus API with sidecars and with Ambient, that you won't have to change the API in any way?
Yeah, if we are committing that the authorization API that is beta is supported by Ambient, it should be supported by Ambient as a beta API, because it's a difference between behavior differences in Ambient itself, which is alpha implementation, and the API stability level, which is what it is.
But we just had a whole month of discussion where we all agreed that we were going to not use workload selector for waypoint proxies.
Whatever we define as a beta support, I mean, we document, if we decide to support that new authorization API in Ambient, it is beta. No, either we create an alpha API that is whatever we want, or we document. So what I'm saying is, if it's beta, we need to be committed to it. So
you were one of the biggest proponents of getting rid of workload selector for waypoints.
I completely agree. No. I'm not saying we should not remove it. We should, if we launch, if we say that Ambient supports authorization without workload selector, yes, we document it and we commit to it. So once we're saying that's how it's supposed to be, we don't go back to it and add it backward.
But at what point? Once Ambient itself is beta?
Ideally now. I mean, if someone is starting to use...
Well, that's exactly what so my topic achieved its goal, is that I wanted to weed out opinions like this early. I don't want us to commit to anything on Ambient today because we don't know, we have no feedback from users on how it works. We haven't even implemented the new workload selector replacement, right? So we have no even internal feedback from our own team. making commitments to things that is basically our one time to make changes on the future of Istio without any real feedback, I think is a mistake. I don't want to commit to anything related to Ambient at this point. Like when you're on Ambient mode, it should be like Ambient deletes your cluster in 1 week, trial, do not rely on anything mode.
Okay, HTTP route in Waypoint, do you commit to it?
I mean, I say that we should probably use those APIs, but the behavior of how they interact in Ambient is totally something that's not guaranteed to be stable.
So
Then it should be clear it's not supported, the beta API.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
can
beta API, sorry, Francis, to interrupt.
Okay.
If you're using an alpha platform, then the fact that the APIs are stable has no meaning. You have the lowest common denominator. It becomes alpha, right? If you use the stable API on the stable data plane, sidecars, then it's stable. But a stable API on the alpha data plane, Ambient, makes the API also alpha and subject to changing behavior, I think. That's how I view it. Like, we can't somehow say that something's stable on an alpha platform.
Stable on alpha doesn't seem to make any sense, but can we agree on some high-level principles here that if the APIs are graduated to beta, then the shape of the API should not change from there on?
No,
we
we
do want
already agreed to break that rule.
No. If we claim it's supported by Ambient, so we're saying Ambient may make a claim that HTTP route is supported, and then we are committed, but we may not make this claim, and we can choose to say that authorization APIs are not supported in Ambient. Try this, it's an alpha experiment, but yeah, I completely agree, John. If we are very clear about, I mean, maybe in context of the safe Istio, we have something similar for Ambient, where the list may be empty, then I think it's reasonable.
Okay, so just to be extra clear, you are okay with saying that there is no compatibility guarantees between 1.18 Ambient Alpha and 1.19 Ambient Alpha / Beta, wherever we get by that point, even with the stable API psychosity policy.
If it's documented clearly, yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's reality. It's first version, first draft.
So Phil has a question in the sidebar. Will Ambient adhere to semantic versioning moving forward once released, or will there be more version changes? Phil, I think that Istio has never revved past the one major version. All of our releases have been minor version releases, which I think technically are not supposed to include breaking changes, though we have had some.
We generally follow the
the
Kubernetes model, which is kind of that the version is unrelated to compatibility, and the compatibility is really the alpha, beta, stable feature stages.
Okay.
Which the alpha, I mean, Ambient will progress through those stages, and we have definitions of what those mean. So, you know, in 1.18, we plan to announce Ambient as alpha, which is basically bad in every category, right? We can make breaking changes that may have security bugs, performance issues, all of the above, which all are true for Ambient today. But once we get to beta, I think there's, I don't know. If you haven't seen it, I can send you a link to the feature stages, which defines it. It's similar to SimBar, but not the same.
But the comment thread is a very
beta to stable, there's a guarantee that is compatibility, right? Is that the understanding?
At individual API level, that's a critical thing. I mean, that's what very well also said. So HTTP route is beta, and it's pretty much guaranteed to be stable, and minor changes when you move to V1. Anything that is alpha, it's alpha. Everything that is in Istio virtual service or authorization, we may have a different API that replaces it, and it may not be supported in Ambient, but will not change it.
Okay, I saw someone had a hand and never spoke. If you still have something to say, please. Okay, unless anyone else has anything, we'll move on to the next one. All right. This is an extension of this giant doc on all the ambient APIs, but specifically about egress. So in the past, we have kind of focused on ingress or producer waypoints where, the producer of a service runs their waypoint, all traffic going to the service goes through their waypoint. And we agreed to kind of defer egress for now and make kind of not the default. So what this new part of the doc is kind of exploring how we can reintroduce egress into ambient and what that might look like. I would say that everything here is pretty up in the air, I'd say. And I also think that just because we're talking about it now doesn't necessarily mean it's even something that we include in the short term. It could be something that we even go to stable without and add it later. Right? It doesn't have to be done, and we don't have to do all of it either. It's kind of progressively more and more features added to this in this doc. I actually had a few more ideas that I didn't put on because I didn't want to add more confusion. But just trying to say, like, we don't need to do all this. We could do some of it or none of it. So let's see. Yeah, so just a reminder, like the baseline behavior today is that even if everyone in the cluster has waypoints, all traffic will not go through them on the egress side. It's only inbound waypoints. So there's no way to have like a consumer override policy or to say like, I want to go through a waypoint when I'm visiting google.com, for example. So in ambient, things are a bit different than with sidecars. In sidecars, we can just match, on the host name google.com or something if we want to match traffic to google.com. But in ambient, we have kind of two layers. So we have ztunnel, which is only doing L4. So we can't possibly tell ztunnel to route traffic to google.com because that requires like host header matching or SNI matching, which ztunnel is not going to do. We can have the waypoint do that because it's doing the L7 processing, but we need to know what traffic to actually get to the waypoint in order for it to do that. So one of the key things is we don't want to send all traffic through the waypoint for egress, at least by default, for a few reasons. One, it's just an extra hop, which is not very performant. And two, at least if we did it the old way, where every waypoint knows about all the destinations in the mesh, like sidecars, then we have the n-squared scaling problem, and we lose a lot of the benefits we have to the simplicity of the XGS and the scalability of it. So in my opinion, we should focus on making it very explicit egress, similar to how ingress is, so that you only actually have routes for the things you're actually going to send traffic through, and it's not just like, sure, give me information about the entire world, which we know doesn't scale. So, well, actually, if there's any questions now before I present more concrete ideas, please. Okay, so the first step, I think, and largely I expect this to be more of a low-level config. There's a higher-level config in the next section, so don't get too hung up on this, is to define kind of an L4 routing API. So if anyone was reading through closely on the XGS doc, there was a section where I proposed adding a route. That's kind of the implementation details of how this API would be implemented, which I think is next on the agenda. So from a user perspective, we would allow them basically create a TCP route. That's part of the Gateway API today, which can match on basically a CIDR or a port and send it to a gateway. Gateway could be an egress gateway or a waypoint. Both of them are represented by gateway, so it's same kind of logic there. And all this says is it tells the ztunnel that this traffic needs to go through the gateway. It doesn't actually configure any routes on that gateway. So if you only have this config, like the traffic would get to the egress gateway or the waypoint, but then it would just be dropped. So this would be useful, for example, you could put in the CIDR ranges like all external IP addresses, for example, if I want to forward all my traffic to an egress gateway. Now, you still need to do config on the egress gateway to forward that to the next hop, but that's covered later. Go ahead, Greg.
Could this be used for kind of replacing the include exclude outbound like IP ranges or ports behavior of the sidecar annotations?
Maybe.
No,
I mean,
no. We
yeah.
are discussing about a separate API to control the IP table. Let's not mix them together.
Yeah, I would prefer, like, in theory, you could jam this API in to do that, but I think
Let's not do that.
I would prefer not to as well. Yeah.
Okay, it sounded very similar, but I agree it's probably too much for one API.
Yeah, this is more saying once the traffic gets to the tunnel after the redirection, what is the next hop? And so we would have kind of, I mean, I'll go more into it later, but a precedence of like, okay, is it a known service? It goes to the service routing. Is it a known pod? It goes to the pod routing. If it matches a route, then it does the routing behavior. And, you know, kind of allows it override beyond the service mechanism.
But Greg, there is an open bug about supporting the annotations and adding a CRD for CNI, Eastern CNI, and it would be really great to prioritize it and to have volunteers to implement that, because that's a completely separate issue. Sorry, John, but it's it's also important.
Agreed. Would you mind scrolling down to the next section? Francis, could you scroll to the next section? Also, you're muted, by the way, if you're talking. Yeah, if you could just focus only on the service egress routes, that would be.
There we go.
Cool. So the way I expect users to use it more commonly would be not doing TCP routes, which is kind of the lower level, but is using the higher level routes like HTTP route. So if we wanted to do a consumer override, for example, where their echo service defines some rules, but I, as in my own namespace, when I override it and, I don't know, set some timeout or whatever. Today, we don't have a way to do that. But in the Gamma API, there's a way they specify on how to do this, which is basically if you are attaching to a service that's in another namespace, then it's considered a consumer override, right? And so we can now, yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, I think we may again confuse the egress, because in Istio Classic, we have two different sides of the API. We have the first part, which is how do you get the traffic to the egress gateway? And then you have the second part is how do you configure an egress gateway? The egress gateway may be an Istio egress gateway, maybe a squid, which I think someone implemented, maybe some other components that is completely outside of our control.
Yeah.
I think from ambient perspective, the most critical part that we need to do is to make sure that we have a clear way to control, and as easy as possible to control that the traffic goes to some egress gateway. How the egress gateway is configured, that's a discussion, open discussion in Gamma and in gateway APIs, and we'll definitely discuss it, but it will be very good to separate the two discussions and not mix them together, because we created a big mess with a virtual service that applies to both egress and sidecars, and it's everywhere. And
yeah, I might agree with you. Maybe I think my doc's a little bit different, but I agree with what you said at the same time. So
okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll present what I have here, but I think it's worth revisiting based on what you said. I completely agree. So like the first part I presented, the TCP route, that is aligned with what you said, right? That is get the traffic.
It is mostly aligned. I would not put 10.000 as an example. I would put the public IP ranges. Sure. And because IP ranges are very difficult to express because there are so many, and IPv6 is also kind of messy. Probably we should have a default behavior where all the public IP addresses go to the egress gateway by default. That's my as usability. I think I had a document in the past about the same thing for regular Istio.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure about default, but maybe we can have like aliases or something so you can say match public, go to egress, and it's 5 lines.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, sorry, I should have raised my hand. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that was the part that I mean. I agree that we need some way to capture the traffic, but in sidecar mode, right, the user doesn't have to be aware of. And I'm not saying that the users aren't aware of these IP ranges, but the user didn't have to care. Whereas now, and I understand the technical limitations of why we're imposing using the TCP route with IP ranges or port ranges, right? But from a user perspective, it requires a different knowledge of the underlying system, right? They need to know potentially the IP ranges of their services that they can say, well, not this IP range or something, right? And I'm not arguing that this is the wrong way. I just want to point out that this feels almost, I understand, like capturing by host, I understand why that is like kind of a non-starter. Like that makes sense to me. I just want to point out the fact that this would be a massive departure in the type, the knowledge required, and maybe therein the type of user that will, need to configure this, and the type of the knowledge you need to do that, etc.
Maybe I was not clear in my proposal earlier. I think John's TCP route is something for advanced users that have, non-standard compliant networks. But for virtual all users, egress should work automatically out of box with no configuration whatsoever. You should not have to put a TCP route in the system or understand routes or CIDRs or anything like that to use egress. If your egress is going from your cluster to internet, and if your internal traffic is, using the private IP ranges as is defined by RFCs, is zero config. Do we agree
Understood.
on this?
So basically, if it's not in the service registry, it would go to the egress gateway. That's what you're suggesting?
The definition of internal is a tricky one. The definition of external is very simple because it's clear that node 10.0 and 192.168 can be routed on egress, so it cannot be egress. But for ingress, we may have some auto detection looking at Kubernetes cluster info to find out the pod CIDR range, and for all clusters in the mesh, we can look at the service CIDR ranges, or we can just say blindly all private IPs are internal and all public.
We can also. Yeah, we could also say just unmatched, all unknown IPs in ztunnel, right?
That's also true. That's also a valid option. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I guess what I'm trying to say here is I think this moves into a potentially complicated space of, how do we make it easy versus how do we make it configurable? And I think that there is a balance here, but I think that, yeah, what you said about potentially sending all unknown IP, all unknown traffic to these egress gateways, that potentially rings true for me. But I think it's that interaction that I just want to make sure we're capturing.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, great. I guess I have a couple of questions. I'll just say them out. You can answer them. So the first question is, the example you showed was for HTTP route. I assume equivalent could be provided for user to use for virtual service? Like the TCP route and the HTTP route you had?
Maybe. I don't know if the TCP route one can use virtual service, to be honest, because we don't have a way in virtual service to say forward to a gateway. We only can forward to a host name. So we could kind of hack it together if we really needed to. I don't know. Maybe is my answer. I should think about it a bit more. We could probably make it work if we so desired.
Okay. Oh, just thinking loud. Yeah, the second question I have is back to what you guys were just discussing about how to detect external traffic. Sorry about the background noise. I was thinking like in Istio, user kind of have to register external traffic with service entries, right? So if they already tell us what are the external traffics, is there any way we can potentially leverage that information with asking them again in the TCP routes? Like in your example, you kind of specify these CEDA block. I have to go to the egress as my next hop.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to avoid was this implicit behavior on the waypoint where it has routing information for the entire world, right? That's why we had to introduce things like sidecar to scope things. And that's something that we have solved so far in Ambient, right? The waypoint only has the minimal amount of information it needs. It's not n squared, it's pretty small. If we say that now every single waypoint in the mesh has access to every single service entry implicitly, we may be back in territory where we suddenly need export 2, we need sidecar scoping or equivalent. It may take us back a step. On the other hand, if it's only things that we've declared as external services, but as like mesh external service entries and not every service in the mesh, it may be more tenable. So I'll again answer your question with maybe it might make sense.
Yeah, I was only thinking for external services. Yeah, just thinking loud here. Unless you think it's a user no longer needs to declare service entry, which I believe they would still have to, right? If it's in registry only mode. Costa, you correct me if I was
Is
wrong.
anyone using registry only mode? I mean, I haven't seen a user to registry only mode since early days of Istio and way before 0.1. It's one option we should remove us. You know, it's
No, yes, there are users. Yes, like people.
Yeah.
Yes, all I'm going to say. Is
okay, we'll keep it, but it's not. It's certainly not very common, popular, or very usable even for most users.
So do you see most of your users just use the egress gateway and route all the traffic to egress gateway?
No. Original destination. So if your application is connected to google.com, it should just work without any extra configuration. You should not create a google.com service entry.
So use the default, which is allow any.
Default
That's
allow
what you
any,
see.
yes. And with what John is proposing, even for classic Istio, we can have that automatically. It will go to the egress gateway, or we can do additional policies.
Yeah, maybe I should have started with the end instead of worked my way up from the low level to the high level. The end goal is basically to allow a mode where you can say, send all unknown traffic to the egress gateway. And the egress gateway needs zero config. It's just doing fully dynamic forwarding based on the requested host. You don't even need service entries at all. So that's kind of the North Star where I'm trying to get to. And when I say egress gateway, that could be a shared egress gateway or a waypoint, if depending on how you want to model it. I think those are effectively equivalent. It's just whether you want to use a dedicated one for your own namespace or service account, or you have a shared one that's in the entire cluster or subsegment, right?
I would not overload the word waypoint for this. I mean, waypoint. Let's keep waypoint for the internal traffic for between pods, and per namespace egress gateway and global egress gateway, it's probably more reasonable. And that also takes care of overrides.
Yeah. Okay. Let me continue. This is a good discussion. Like I said, this was meant to be kind of early draft, so a lot of good feedback, and definitely I'm not trying to just push through what I have written here. I think I completely agree with most things that have been said. But I will go through what I wrote. So, oh yeah, sorry, going back to what Lynn said on service entry, one issue with that is that the vast majority of service entries don't have IP addresses or their VIPs assigned, right? You don't say, here's my google.com service entry, it's at 1234, right? You just say google.com. It's pretty rare to have a static IP defined in a service entry. And so most service entries probably would not actually be useful for this purpose. Yeah, Quat.
How do you even know host name? Is it because of SNI or is it because of?
Oh, that's what I'm saying. Is like if you just say google.com, then ztunnel can't do anything about it, right? It can only do things that have IPs defined, and almost no one has an IP defined for a service entry for an external service.
Yeah, but if you still have SNI, right? So you could match an SNI.
We could, but we're not even doing SNI sniffing in ztunnel, right?
And you don't have to. I mean, Google is an external address. You can use HBON to the egress gateway. You don't need SNI in this case. I mean, the egress gateway may apply SNI if it chooses to, or deep packet inspection, or man in the middle, or whatever they choose to do.
Yeah. So
my question was basically the current service entry binding. Is it based on the host or SNI?
Currently, you can assign a VIP. Or you can have, obviously you have a host name as well. And then depending on if it's HTTP, TCP, or SNI, or TLS, we do IP, the SNI, or the host name. So it depends on the protocol and what fields they provide. Yeah. Like generally, the idea here is that ztunnel is not going to do much of any routing here. So in most cases, you probably want to say, send all traffic that I don't know about through the egress, and then the egress will do all the processing from there. Or you say, I don't care about this fancy egress stuff, just direct go from ztunnel, and for more performance, skip a hop. which we could even have as a cluster level config, right? The other case, though, is not external traffic, but it's more for overrides for internal traffic, which is a little bit different, because in that case, we do know the IP addresses, so we can have more focused routes that say, when I am connecting to Echo app, then I want to go through my egress waypoint and apply some different policies. So I think Austin may not like this potentially, because you said you wanted things split, but here it's not split. So what this would do is actually configure two parts. It would configure ztunnel and waypoint, but it would configure them differently. If you can scroll down a bit. Thank you. So on ztunnel, this would basically say, like the equivalent of it, we wouldn't actually literally have this route, but this is like how we would program ztunnel, is say, okay, match the Echo IP on this specific port and send it to the waypoint proxy. And then on the waypoint proxy, if you scroll down again, today we match on, like our default matches would be on each producer service and then all the pods that are behind the waypoint. We would basically just append a match on these consumer services for things that we have defined. So there would be a new match on the Echo IP import, and then we could do whatever routing L7 logic that they had configured in their override. So the main difference here is that it's not implicit. Each user or each namespace is explicitly configuring their override. So the waypoint is not being bloated with a bunch of configuration. It's only as they explicitly add these overrides, which are pretty rare, that we're adding more and more routes. So we shouldn't have this n-squared problem where every waypoint knows about every service in the mesh. That's the main thing, I think. I had some more info that I wrote up on another doc about the more, like, once we get to the egress gateway, using the kind of first step, how do we do the routing from there? Like today, you can configure an egress gateway to do all these routes, but it's pretty painful, as everyone probably knows. So kind of like the North Star that I talked about, like, okay, send all unknown traffic to the egress, and then the egress kind of magically figures out how to send the traffic from there. I had some ideas for that. I didn't have time to write them down here, but it's something that we should explore, and happy to get more opinions on this. Yeah, more opinions on this part, especially Costin. I'm curious if you think this violates your splitting of the.
Well, I still believe it will be better to have separate documents, separate use cases, separate tests for each of those individual use cases. I mean, but in the end, yes, it will be a TCP route for advanced users. And the mechanism, I completely agree with you. And I just, again, don't like the confusion about too many use cases in a single doc and in a single API. But maybe for 1.0, for actually 1.0, for next version, for alpha version of Ambient, maybe we should focus on only one, which is probably the most important, which is to have the automatic behavior, maybe with minimum configuration and TCP route upstream is more stable. I don't think we have CIDR range in Gamma yet in TCP route. I don't remember.
I think they added it and was removed, because I swear it was there and I just looked today and it was gone. So
yeah, so we have to add it back. But I would prefer to have the upstream TCP route handle this, not ours. And then, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a spec, we follow it. But as a spec implementation, defaults should definitely be work out of box and should be the first priority.
Yeah, so just to be clear, like, I don't think we should do any of this in the short term. I wanted to present it now because I think it helps to have kind of at least a vague vision of where we should go, and because a lot of people have talked about this. But absolutely, I think ingress, we should focus heavily on stabilizing that.
I kind of disagree with if we can. I mean, we should at least have a way to redirect public addresses to the egress gateway, because it's a pretty gap. And
well, you still need then, once you get to the egress gateway.
Not our egress gateway. Whatever egress gateway it is, assuming that you have Squid, because that's the whole idea of Connect, because you can play Squid there and whatever you want. Sure. And it will respect Connect gateway, and that's why we choose H1 as protocol after all.
Got it. Yeah, okay. I see. Yeah, that's fair. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, so Joe, I think this is probably clear to you and Carsten and people who are very familiar with the Gateway API. It might be worthwhile for you to highlight what's in this proposal unique to Istio that's not part of the Gateway API. Is it just the CEDA block? I couldn't tell.
Yeah, so for the consumer override part, that is following the Gamma spec, just as defined. The only thing that's a little odd about it, I mean, like most people following the spec do it by sidecar configuration, right? So we are the only ambient waypoint implementation, so it's kind of a novel implementation of the API, but it is following the spec as it's defined. The first part with just like this TCP route, kind of binding to the namespace, forwarding to a gateway. I think that's fairly novel. I don't think there's really a forward to gateway that's been defined by the spec. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it's something that we could probably put in the spec as something that's a kind of well-known backend ref, but it's not something that I've seen used before. I mean, it's allowed. Like backend ref can refer to anything, but it's not a standardized backend ref.
But we can refer to the service itself. We can follow exactly the spec and refer to the service associated with the gateway.
We could, but it's kind of nice to not rely on the service because we may not have a service, right?
We can do both. We can do both. We can, yeah. I mean, as a spec is extended. I mean, but definitely the spec.
So the spec allows us to forward to anything. So
yeah, no.
Yeah.
I think we should be compliant to the spec. That's whatever the spec allows and supports. We should also. And other vendors.
I just don't want the implementation details of the waypoint, like service and deployment, to rise into the API if we can avoid it. Because they may not actually be there, right? You may have a waypoint that's actuated by some cloud load balancer, or it lives in a different cluster, runs on a VM, whatever. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, whether you refer to a gateway or the service for the gateway, they're both supported. It just comes down to what support level, right? So if we refer to the service of the gateway, then that is considered core support. But John, I do agree. I like the idea of actually using gateway as a backend ref as opposed to the service for the gateway. As you mentioned, maybe the gateway doesn't have a service, but I think just abstracting away the service layer from the gateway and being able to have that mental model that says, hey, you're just routing to this particular gateway and not necessarily worrying about whether there's a service there or not.
But are we in agreement that TCP route is advanced option that people who don't use the standard CIDRs use, and by default out of box Ambient should just work with zero config?
I agree. Ambient should work with zero config out of the box. I don't think that working with zero config out of the box means all traffic should go through an egress.
No,
I think it should be easy to do that, but should it be default? Probably not.
But for waypoints, don't we do the same thing? I mean, if I create the waypoint in my namespace, all the incoming traffic goes to if I create an egress in my namespace, shouldn't the egress from namespace go to that egress?
I think there's two issues with that. One is we don't have any concept of Istio of an egress gateway. We just have gateways. So
sure, but you don't have a concept of a waypoint either. I mean, if we have a label,
actually, waypoint is different. It's its own gateway class. But AM2, even if we send all the traffic there, the gateway is going to just drop it all, right? We also need to add the part where the gateway can.
That's not entirely true. I mean, a normal proxy is just proxying, and they apply.
No, an Istio one, yeah. So I'd be fine with adding a way to say that you can send all traffic to X gateway. I have absolutely no problem with that, and it could be a higher level API than TCP route. It could be cluster wide setting, mesh config. I don't know. Well, I mean, Mike said the API. I have no issues with that. But I don't think it's like out of the box default, like you just install Ambient and suddenly your traffic's going through this.
No, you install gateway. Ambient and you create a gateway class egress gateway or egress, new egress gateway. I mean, just like waypoint. So completely mirroring what we did for endpoint. You create a gateway with the class ambient
Yeah.
gateway namespace with the specification it's HBON speaking, and then it's automatically doing, forwarding everything to.
I mean, I like the idea of it. My issue is that there's no Istio implementation that can support that today. You have to deploy a third-party thing like Squid. And so if you're deploying Squid, then it's not going to be the Istio gateway class. Like, I feel like we're close there, but there's some gaps, or at least in my understanding. You see what I mean? Like, I totally agree. We can label something as like, this is the egress point, but how we do that, I think.
So we need to make Istio egress gateway compatible with HBON. So once we make it, and that also covers multi-network, covers consumer overrides and other things, then we are in business.
I feel like there's two different parts. There's forwarding to some third-party egress, which all we need to do is, well, one, they need to support HBON, which I don't know how close that is, or if it's done. We just need to get the traffic there. On the other hand, if we want to use first party, then we need to get the traffic there, and we also need to make it accept all the traffic and pass through, right? Which I think we should do, but it's a bit more work than just getting the traffic there from the Z tunnel. And I agree with what Quat said in chat that a regular waypoint can be turned into egress. I completely agree that we should. And that's kind of what I was pitching in the stock, is that you can forward to a centralized egress gateway like we do today. There's use cases for that. But we also should be able to forward through our namespace waypoint as the egress point. And there's trade-offs there and which one you would use for different use cases. I forget, Mitch or Lynn was first. I think it was Lynn.
Lynn's up first.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree, zero config is nice, but I do think there are most likely a lot of user wants the flexibility to be able to config whether it goes to maybe there's no waypoint or even no egress gateway, or maybe there's a waypoint on the way out, or maybe there's the egress gateway on the way out. So with all these conditions, I just don't know how can we get the zero config correctly. So I would say not something I would want to see it in default. I think having the flexibility to allow user to config is probably more important at this stage.
I don't think we are disagreeing. I mean, we should have definitely advanced the configuration, and we should probably also have easy user configuration. But which one we prioritize and which one is first, I would say most common use cases should probably come first, not the advanced use cases. But because we get more time to play with the APIs, but the common use case, it's relatively clear, no?
Not really. If you think about it in the context of multiple cluster, and then the traffic goes to maybe an Amazon Lambda service, you may have different requirements that would.
But that's not a common case. Common case is common applications that connects to an API outside of your cluster.
But common cases also, you have more than one cluster, right?
Sure, each cluster is independent. I mean, I don't think having a shared cross multi-cluster egress gateway is also a common case.
No, just isolated control plane that's multi-clustered, and you do cross-cluster traffic, which is pretty common too. All I'm just saying is, these scenarios, you might want to config your backend ref differently, right? So anything done automatically could be wrong in that sense.
No, I agree with you, Lynn. I'm just arguing that if that's a common case that most users have, and because most multi-clusters are a bit more advanced than single cluster with an application just going to Squid or some enterprise proxy to the internet.
Yeah, but we don't want break user when they grow out of one cluster to two cluster either, right?
Sure, and then they will apply some configuration. That's clear. I mean, we're not breaking them. We're just saying it's super easy to do the simple things. And for advanced things or a bit more complicated things, you will need a bit of configuration. It was Java principle for a long time.
Yeah, probably should let Mitch go next, Mitch.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't have particular comments on this issue, but I noticed that there are increasingly issues that spur on a lot of really healthy discussion in our group, which is fantastic. I'm wondering how we make decisions on those issues. Ordinarily, that would fall to a work group lead, but this is not an official work group of the Istio project, so we don't have any leads. At some point, you know, with Ambient being ready to launch to alpha in the very near future, we need to decide and commit. I'm wondering how we do that.
I think when it's come down to decisions, we've usually been able to reach that. I'm not saying that this will always happen, but this is just brought up today. So I think like there's obviously going to be a healthy amount of discussion about it. And like as the design continues to iterate, like we will come to like I think we should have a formal process, but I do think this being brought up for the first time usually will bring up quite a bit of things that, you know, because the original designer is not going to have everyone's input immediately, and so like that's natural. I guess is what I'm saying for this particular design.
But what decision to make? I mean, the only thing is if someone volunteers to implement some parts of this document, it will be alpha experimental as Ambient is, and the main decision will be to move to beta particular implementation. We're not, you know, we never said no to trying something out in Istio, as far as I know.
Okay, so we do have consensus on where we're going with regard to this design doc.
Well, I kind of disagree with Costin. We should say no to alpha things because usually when things go alpha, they also go beta. On this doc, I am not disappointed at all with the amount of discussion. It was very much intended to be an early pulse on what people needed, what people thought, where we wanted to go. On other docs, I mean, that's maybe a different story, right? That there is a general lack of the working group leads as a resolution mechanism. But even in the normal working groups, we don't typically rely on that anyways. Generally, if we can't come to agreement on something, which is exceedingly rare, it ends up moving directly to the TOC, which we could do here. But I really can't remember in the past year a time when we actually escalated a disagreement.
Okay, well, if what we're doing right now is working, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that we're able to move documents forward at a reasonable pace.
It's not the documents, but the actual, you know, implementations that is problematic.
Go ahead.
Speaking of moving forward at a reasonable pace, do you think we could move forward to the next item at this reasonable pace?
I do. Yes, I agree. I just want to say one quick thing that I remembered before I forget. One issue we may have with this consumer override business is that now the waypoint has a different identity from the workload. So by adding a consumer policy, your identity that is used will change. So we will need to account for that. But that being said, can we go to the next doc, Francis?
Yeah. So basically, let's not make a decision on this stock because many of the people are just first time seeing it on the egress. So we can revisit next time. I think we all need a little bit more time. But go ahead, John.
Yes. So if you could open that. So this is the same doc we went over last week, but it's been refined a bit based on the discussion. I don't think there's much groundbreaking changes. It's just maybe more concrete if you weren't following the crazy mess of ideas flowing through last week. One thing in particular, if you can scroll down somewhere in there, there's a route message, right? Maybe a little further. I think it's in the code. Here we go. Yeah, this message. So I put this in here. It's maybe a little premature. I don't actually think this should be the last part of this doc we implement probably because it's tied to the previous discussion, which is still up in there. But I just wanted to add it here for completeness. So I think this would be kind of another XDS type that we'd consider adding for Ambient. That would just do like the L7 routing. which would effectively be like the TCP route just in our own schema. So, match some CIDR and port, send it to some destination, and that's about it. So just wanted to quickly introduce that. We definitely can debate the exact details, and it doesn't make sense to add this to zTunnel until we have, the actual user-facing APIs defined. But I just wanted to introduce that real quick. Lynn, you want to discuss this. Was there specific parts that you wanted to go over on this?
No, so I think this looks great. Sorry, I'm on my mobile phone. I think last time you discussed that you're going to add the weight in the workload resources. I wasn't sure if it's added. So with that in place, I think it's reasonable. I more want to know if anybody has strong objection to this. Because I think Kevin might already been writing some of these, and John, you probably already also started some of these. So I just want to say, people are looking at moving to implement this if there's strong objections.
Carson?
So I will not say a strong objection. I mean, definitely we need to represent the routes because we need to implement TCP route in Gamma and Gateway and the previous documents that you described. So that needs to be represented somehow. And there is a discussion quite about if it should be done to LDS, which already kind of covers this to some extent. If you have a kind of convoluted set of envoy filters and other things, you could express kind of the same thing with cluster and the current API. And probably that's what, because we do have TCP routes today.
Hold up, before we go down this rabbit hole, what Lynn was talking about on controversy was everything but the route. I'm very
the route. I guess we're in no rush to implement it. Just so everybody knows.
Everything but route, I don't think we have disagreement. Okay, perfect.
So my only concern is that we have this standard protos for doing what this proto does. So we're just duplicating them, and that doesn't seem right because we already have infrastructure to handle the same protos in gRPC and Envoy, and now we're going to have a completely different set of protos that zTunnel uses for the same thing.
But they're not standard. I mean, the protos define some fields, some filters that can be combined in different ways to achieve some configurations, but there is no standard way to define, that's
no, the protos in XDS are not just about filters. It's about matching, it's about routes, it's about addresses. All of those primitives are there.
Okay, let's postpone the discussion on route. I think I agree. The route can be discussed later. But
just to clarify, is your concern that you mentioned there for route only, or for also the rest of the stock, the workload and service API?
I have concerns about the rest, but I don't have a good way to express them. I think it's just too much stuff in one proto, in my opinion. But specifically for routes, I don't think it's right to duplicate it. It's not new. I mean, it's the same thing that was already there.
Yeah, that's fair. So, Kwat, if you have any other comments that you feel it's unnecessarily complex, please try entering the document.
Yeah, I mean, we should just include people from XDS, like gRPC and Envoy-related folks, because this is not new. I mean, I've seen this stuff already, so I don't know why we need to have an entirely new definition while we could just take a subset and implement it.
What that would imply is that zTunnel or any implementation of H1 and Ambient will have to be Envoy effectively, or support the Envoy configuration model, and have listeners, have the same kind of filters. And if we have the problem with proxy gRPC, by the way, someone adds a field to something, proxy gRPC C++ implementation will crash because they have strict validation for something. So it's not entirely true that you have listener filter and so forth, and automatically gRPC and Envoy work. It's just you need to have exactly specific fields in the forms that they expect, and they implement it in very specific ways.
Yeah, but again, this is not new. I mean, this problem exists already, as you say, of gRPC having to implement the XDS. There's also a mobile Envoy that also doesn't implement all of Envoy XDS. It's just not new, right? I mean, this problem has already been decided, and we already have a strategy to deal with this. I just don't know why we're not participating.
Yeah, I think this is not something we're going to solve in this meeting. It's something we've discussed quite a bit. Happy to discuss more, but very happy to delay the route until we fully resolve it. But I don't think it should block adding what is effectively 2 fields to the existing API we have. Like it's kind of in some ways a philosophical discussion of like, should we use existing APIs or should we use new APIs that are purpose-built for us, right? And that's not something that we can easily say, this is better or this is worse, right? There's just different opinions. And the current decision that we have made has been to make our own purpose-built APIs. We can revisit that, but I don't think tweaks to the API should be blocked on revisiting that discussion. Now, this is the exact type of thing that, like Mitch's comment on how we resolve this. I think it'd be very reasonable to have this go to TOC to weigh in on what our direction is, because this is a high-level API decision on whether we are aligning on existing APIs or defining our own, right? That's a very TOC type decision to make.
So can we potentially separate this from the two, like the workload API changes?
Yeah, that's what I was recommending. We
okay.
already have the workload. We should continue to enhance it to work properly for use cases. We can also, in parallel, have discussion of should we scrap workload.
Okay, let's scrap route, for example, from the workload proposal, and it's a
I think route's even more controversial, so I'm perfectly happy with scrapping.
Yeah, let's scrap route for now and focus on the other one. The other one is already kind of approved, so it's just adding 2 fields. And what are the new fields?
The main thing, there's a new service API dedicated to representing a service, so that we can put things like affinity and other service level objects, like host name. We don't even have host name today. And then in the actual workload itself, the only thing really is that we make waypoint a bit more flexible than just an IP address, so that it can be a host name and have a port. And we make a network gateway field so we can do multi-network. And the key will now include the network instead of just the IP address, which was kind of just an oversight in the initial.
Isn't service also controversial due to CDS and EDS? I mean, that's probably even more controversial because CDS and EDS are actually the part of XDS that are more stable and
maybe
of implementation.
I don't know. You tell me if it's controversial.
I would. Can we use CDS for service in cTunnel?
I mean, I personally have a pretty strong opinion on that we do it this way, but I'm very biased. I wrote the doc, obviously. There's other people who would agree with you, I'm sure, probably Quad, and I know some other people have expressed similar opinions. So if there's this tension, then we can have a resolution and discuss this in the TOC if we're aligning on Envoy or making our new types.
Okay, I'm gonna be honest. I feel like we spent like a lot of time talking about this a couple months ago. And this takes basically this doc and throws us back to December. So if we want, I agree with John that if we want to align, if we want to make the decision now, if we want to decide now that we want to align the entire API with XDS, that's a much higher level discussion, and we should take it out of this meeting right now, because there are folks in this meeting that are blocked on this design. So, if we want to make that higher level design, I don't think this is the right time, as John was saying. So.
Yeah, I will say as well that please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Louis, Lynn, and I are pretty strongly in favor of using these APIs rather than the Envoy APIs. So I'm not saying we can't change that. I'm just saying we have discussed this, and there is an almost consensus on at least part of the TOC.
But John, we had a discussion about the workload discovery service, which is specific for pod-to-pod, for something that is not covered by existing APIs. It's pretty different because it covers other use cases.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that if it's a global decision that affects all APIs. I'm not completely opposed with, except for route. I'm not completely opposed for not using CDS, CDS. And my interest would be actually to have, istio defederate and read CDS, CDS and generate this API at least. So we support CDS, CDS, but because that's a problem. There are all kinds of implementations that already, I mean, it's a console, remember console implementation, which we translated to console to XDS bridge, and there are other ways to generate endpoints and clusters to XDS.
Okay, so can I ask Eitan, like you were pushing pretty heavily for this to go quickly because I assume you're locked in it for your use cases. Is that the service portion of it? Or is it useful to even just like, I don't think the workload part, which is a very small tweak just to fix multi-network basically, is controversial.
And maybe add weights too.
Oh yeah, we can add weights. I forgot to put that in the doc, but
Okay, good. Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Ada. I can't answer for you, but I want you to answer it.
No, I mean, yeah, that exactly. Yeah, that is what we are blocked on.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And to be honest, the service change is pretty small too. If you look at the doc, right? There's only like a couple of fields for the service. And most of the workload change, it's already been implemented. It's just adding 2 or 3 other fields.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not against it. I mean, I'm perfectly fine with having this as a private API. The only thing that I'm strongly for is to have ability to bridge existing EDS, CDS implementation into Ambient. So through federation, through the things that we had before, that's my only concern. I'm not saying that Z-tunnel all our implementation must support CDS and EDS. Just that a system that is using CDS, EDS in some parts must be supported somehow.
sure. I mean, if you can get this information and translate it into these APIs and send it to Z-tunnel over XDS, how you got it is irrelevant, right? You could have got that from Kubernetes service. You could have got it over XDS.
Yeah, for me, that's the only thing that matters. Yeah.
Why can't you just do it internally? I mean, you just consume it and translate internally.
In where Z-tunnel consumes CDS?
Complexity.
Right.
Yeah, there's two reasons why we did this. One is that the performance is, in our measurements, over 10x better to do it this way than to shove it into, square peg and round hole of the XDS APIs that exist today. And the other is complexity, right? Like we don't handle 95% of the fields in cluster, but they now may be set, and we need to figure out what we do there. It has this deep structure, lots of allocations, all these issues.
Well, you don't need to set those fields. It's a protos. It doesn't really matter if you don't use those fields.
Yeah, but it's also like why? What is the benefit? It's not like we can just go plug into Console's XDS server and read their things, because we're going to need all this information that's shoved into metadata, basically. It's an Istio-specific config that we're shoving into, basically a map of string, because it's an existing API, but there's no value in that.
Well, I mean, you have the same concepts. You have a concept of a connection pool. That's a cluster. So one way or another, you're gonna create the same abstractions, just in a different shape.
We don't have a connection of a connection pool. That's the whole point of the Ambient XDS, is that it's higher level APIs that are declarative. Nowhere in here are we saying that they're how these things should behave. Like Envoy is effectively imperative, right? You're saying, oh, this is a cluster, it's a connection pool. We don't say that in the Z-tunnel API. We say, here's a service. Go figure out what a service means, right?
A data plane uses a concept of a connection pool in any data plane. Like there is a semantical notion there somewhere, right, inside the code. And
sure.
The textual representation of that is a cluster.
Yeah, but that's not at all what we're doing. We don't even have like a service becomes a connection pool. The connection pooling logic is 100% orthogonal to the API, right? We're not tying the implementation details to the API like Envoy does. That's the key, and that's why we're able to have these efficiency and simplicity gains.
I understand why what you do is for endpoints. So IP-based resolution, I get the point. When you get into routing and services, it gets lousy, because now you're effectively doing the same thing, but it's just...
Yeah, so we already have services in the existing API as of today. It's just inlined into workload.
Yeah. Right, that's what's odd, is because The inlining is just the reference.
The inlining
thing
is
that,
about looking at how the API scales efficiently in real world use cases rather than tying it to implementation details. So yes, like Envoy does clusters that then point to endpoints, but that has implications on performance, right? Now, anytime we want to update an endpoint, we have to resend the list of endpoints. If we have a workload that's in multiple services, which is very common with multiple ports, because really it's a service port pair,
So
you have to resend, you have that endpoint duplicated, right? So we've taken that, inverted it, and it's much more efficient.
So John,
So there is a reason why it's done this way, is because that's how Google infrastructure works, right? We don't have a ability to connect to endpoints. We have ability to connect to services.
Sure, but this is not Google
limit
infrastructure. This is zTunnel, right? I don't care how Google load balancer works when I'm implementing zTunnel, because they're a completely different problem that required completely different APIs to configure efficiently.
And Google can do that as well. But I want to make two points here. One about route, actually, sorry for going back, to make it less controversial. My suggestion was to use the TCP route defined by the upstream API, which has almost all the elements that we need.
Which one?
And that the one defined by TCP route in Gateway API. It's a proto. So that will make it very less completely uncontroversial, because that's pushed up an API defined upstream by Kubernetes. We don't invent anything new. We just send the same proto that is used by Kubernetes. And probably for service endpoint slice, for example, if we have a representation of the proto used by endpoint slice, it should not be controversial. We're just using XDS as a distribution mechanism for protos defined by Kubernetes, which again, nobody can object that endpoint slice is a standard API for representing endpoints. And the other comment is that we can treat, we are changing the Istio APIs to upstream Gamma and Gateway APIs. Probably Envoy also needs some, the APIs have been around for a while. We learn a lot of lessons. It's very reasonable to have some simpler APIs that maybe proxyless gRPC and even Envoy may adopt at some point. Like you implemented the workload for Envoy. Maybe at some point they should also adopt endpoint slice and TCP route as a high-level concept that are simpler. I don't think we necessarily are diverging from Envoy. We're just trying some new ways to do things more efficiently that Envoy should adopt as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. We need to include them, because we can always implement the same thing in Envoy. It's not really that Envoy
Then we are in agreement.
has a standard.
Yeah, no, definitely we want whatever is defined here should also adopt the proxyless gRPC. We'll have to, and probably by Envoy as well. No,
I have no problem.
We need to start a PR process in CNCF XDS and involve people that are familiar with this.
Yeah, but they're not blocked on it. We are not blocked on it. We can start.
Oh yeah, but it takes quarters to get it, all of them agreed. So unless you start it now, it'll never happen, right?
I agree.
I have no problem taking what we feel is the best API and bringing it beyond zTunnel. But I do have a problem with taking a subpar API for our use case and bringing it into zTunnel just for the purpose of conforming with an existing API when these are not even user-facing APIs, right? Like, we should make sure that we are most efficient and simple, bug-free, etc. That is more important than conforming to existing APIs for an internal API, in my opinion. So if we start with making it the best thing and then bringing that to others, that's great. But I don't think that we should make zTunnel worse just for the sake of matching others.
Right, but that means we shouldn't be forking. We should be involving people and working together, right? That means we need to evolve existing stuff to the shape we want.
I think we are all in agreement here. John is saying that we want to improve some APIs. We all agree that all those APIs, we want to promote them and to be adopted by, gRPC and other folks. So there is no disagreement really here. John is not saying that we are not going to propose this to Envoy and Proxyless. And we want some interoperability. We do want to be, just like we do want to be tied to a single implementation of Ambient, we also do want to be tied to a single implementation of XDS server. There are other integration points that we need to consider. So can we move forward with the small changes and in parallel push it to also to the others?
That's fine with me. I thought you were the one pushing back to service.
No. I'm saying that we need to be careful with how we integrate with existing XDS servers. If we have a way to integrate it to translate, I'm happy.
Yeah, the layer of how do we get the Istio internal representation, which has many sources, files, Kubernetes, XDS. That's orthogonal from then how Istio takes that internal representation and sends it to ztunnel, in my opinion. So we could have absolutely any config source you want that we end up implementing, and that's perfectly fine. But then there's one API between ztunnel and Istio. All right, we're well over time. Either everyone froze or I froze, but sounds like this is probably a good place to wrap up.
I was going to say, is this something we can resolve today, or should take this offline?
Well, I think the main concern was about route, and we've all at least established that route's deferred.
Yep, I think next step is the PR to change the API, and I don't think there are objections, and we need to take it off to start discussion with the other and to complete the. I don't think there is disagreement about trying to upstream them.
Yeah, I have no issue upstreaming it. I just have issue using the existing upstream ones.
Right.
Okay.
Next week.
Perfect. Take care, folks.
Well.